The heat still clung to the twisted skin of the aircraft when the German engineers arrived. Smoke drifted from what had been the forward fuselage of a B-29 Superfortress, brought down outside Kawasaki in late 1944. The U.S. crew had already been taken away, but the wreck remained. A silver carcass sprawled across a field. When the German technical liaison team, led by Captain Otto Brenner and electrical specialist Wilhelm Eckhardt, stepped inside, they expected chaos. In Luftwaffe aircraft, a shot-down bomber usually revealed a tangle of wires, cut, blackened, indistinguishable. Yet what they found inside the B-29 stopped them cold. Even in ruin, the bomber's interior looked deliberate. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of color-coded cables ran in organized veins along the ribs of the fuselage. Red, yellow, black, and blue strands, each secured in bundles, each tagged with tiny metal plates stamped with numbers. It resembled not destruction, but anatomy, an exposed nervous system. Brenner whispered to Eckhardt, "This is not wiring, it's thinking." They had seen many American aircraft before, P-40s in Africa, B-24s in Italy, but nothing like this. The B-29's wiring was not assembled as art. It was designed as logic. Every component could be followed, traced, and replaced. Even the power lines feeding the tailgun turret were arranged in parallel symmetry, with exact spacing between clamps. The engineers kneeled in silence. For men trained in Germany's most advanced technical institutes, Dresden, Aachen, and Junkers-Dessau, order was not new. But this was something else. Order multiplied, standardized, and industrialized. They realized they were staring not at the genius of one engineer, but at the intelligence of a system. Behind them, the Japanese interpreter read aloud a Boeing production plate recovered from the wreck. Boeing Aircraft Company, Wichita, Kansas, February 1944. That detail made Brenner pause. Wichita had produced hundreds of these in the same month. In Germany, the creation of a bomber required months of craftsmanship and master electricians. In America, it had become routine. The air smelled of burnt insulation and hydraulic fluid, yet beneath the damage was unmistakable intention. Where German machines revealed pride, this one revealed planning. Where theirs required experience, this required procedure. For the first time, Eckhardt felt something close to humility. He thought of the war factories back home, where shortages forced improvisation, where blueprints were rewritten overnight. Here, even in wreckage, he saw consistency. He took out a small field notebook and wrote one line. They build as if they expect thousands to follow the same pattern. Outside, the evening sun reflected on the aluminum skin, turning the wreck into a dull mirror. In that reflection, the engineers saw something unsettling. A glimpse of a nation that fought not just with machines, but with an organized mind. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. The engineers spent the following morning inside the B-29 wreck with notebooks, pencils, and fragments of burnt cable laid carefully on tarpaulins. What began as curiosity turned into reverence. Each wire carried a printed code, each terminal a tiny stamped number. Even after fire and shrapnel, the logic remained readable. Brenner traced one circuit from the pilot's console to the engine nacelle and realized it matched an identical pattern on the opposite wing. The system was symmetrical by design. In Luftwaffe planes, circuits often varied between production runs. Here, they were identical, as if copied from a living template. Eckhardt discovered a label tied to a junction box that read, Wiring Assembly 57C. A small tag listed the date, plant, and inspector initials. That detail fascinated him more than the technology itself. It meant responsibility was recorded, not to intimidate workers, but to ensure continuity. Every bomber in Kansas, Washington, and Nebraska followed the same electrical grammar. America had turned craftsmanship into language. In a half-burned operations manual recovered near the wreck, they found diagrams so clear that even a factory apprentice could follow them. Symbols were uniform, lines precise, spacing standardized. It was not written for engineers alone. It was written so anyone could think mechanically. Brenner realized the meaning behind it. This was not just an aircraft wiring plan. It was a translation of American industrial thought, transparent, teachable, and transferable. He remembered the words of a U.S. technical leaflet intercepted months earlier. Any man properly trained can replace any other man. At the time, German officers mocked it as naive democracy. Now seeing the B-29's internal order, Brenner understood it was the essence of scalability. Germany had built machines for experts. America built systems for participation. At noon, they rested beside the fuselage, drinking bitter coffee brought by Japanese guards. Eckhart remarked how every cable color seemed chosen with purpose: white for neutral, red for ignition, blue for instrumentation. He compared it to a printed alphabet. One could read an entire aircraft by tone and hue. Each wire, he murmured, is a sentence in an industrial language. In that quiet, the truth settled heavily. The Americans had created a method where technology was no longer dependent on a few brilliant minds, but on collective understanding. Knowledge was democratized through numbering and instruction. What they saw was not just electricity, it was ideology made visible. As the sun lowered, the engineers gathered their samples and prepared a report for Berlin. Brenner wrote the summary line that would echo in his later interrogation at Wright Field. They have not merely wired a bomber, they have wired a civilization. That night, under the dim light of a lantern, the German engineers sat in their quarters near Tachikawa Airfield, comparing notes. One question echoed between them. How could such mechanical uniformity exist across a continent? Brenner opened his logbook, which contained sketches of the B-29 circuits, and drew two side-by-side diagrams, one labeled Luftwaffe, the other USA. The difference was stark. German aircraft, like the Ju-88 or T-111, relied on unique wiring layouts for each variant, often modified mid-production due to shortages or design changes. A single missing resistor or misrouted line could halt assembly. Meanwhile, the Americans built modular harnesses, prefabricated in factories far from the airfield, tested before installation, and labeled so any worker could attach them without consulting an engineer. Heinemann, once chief electrician at Junkers, frowned as he recalled his factory days in Dessau. Every bomber there required a craftsman's signature. He had prided himself on precision, on solder joints that reflected light like glass. Yet he also remembered the chaos, orders changing overnight, mechanics improvising when copper ran short, engineers arguing over diagrams that no two departments interpreted the same way. "We built art," he sighed, "and they built architecture." The comparison grew crueler as the data deepened. The Americans had trained 300,000 aircraft electricians during the war. Boeing's Wichita plant alone employed more than 40,000 people, producing a B-29 every 72 hours by 1944. Germany's fragmented industries could never match such rhythm. Where the Luftwaffe relied on specialists, the U.S. Air Force relied on processes. Eckhart wrote in his diary that evening, "The irony is painful. We have the best engineers, yet our machines depend on them like children depend on fathers. The Americans have created machines that live without parents." 2 weeks later, the team received permission to visit a Japanese electrical workshop producing communication gear under German license. The contrast was immediate. Workers struggled with mismatched diagrams and improvised insulation. No color coding, no labeling, only memory. Brenner stood silently and realized this was Germany's mirror image, brilliant minds surrounded by confusion. He thought of the neat cables inside the B-29, glowing softly in his memory like ordered thoughts. What chilled him most was the realization that America's strength was reproducibility. A young woman in Kansas, a factory foreman in Detroit, and a soldier in Guam could all understand the same diagram. It was not genius, it was agreement. As the lantern burned low, Heinemann finally whispered what none dared admit. "They have found a way to make intelligence itself into a system." Outside, a distant siren moaned over Tokyo's blackout. Inside, the silence of understanding settled heavier than any bomb. When the engineers were eventually transported to the United States in 1945, their first stop was Wright Field in Ohio, the great repository where America collected the enemy's secrets. To Brenner, it felt less like a base and more like a cathedral of logic. Rows of dismantled aircraft filled the hangars, each accompanied by teams of uniformed technicians calmly cataloging, labeling, photographing. No one barked orders. Everyone seemed to know their place in a greater rhythm. The Germans, once proud of their technical discipline, now found themselves surrounded by a society that practiced it instinctively. What fascinated them most wasn't the machinery, but the human system that supported it. In the Boeing production archives, they learned that any worker could halt an entire assembly line if they noticed an error, a concept inconceivable in the authoritarian world they had served. American democracy, Brenner realized, wasn't only political. It was wired into every process. The electrician trusted the inspector trusted the manual trusted the worker. This circular trust created precision without fear. In their notebooks, the engineers sketched wiring looms and test benches, but also the faces of the people they met. They saw women with sleeves rolled up, hands steady over circuit boards, laughing between tasks. They saw black technicians working beside white ones, both holding the same authority over the machinery. The Germans whispered among themselves, uneasy. In their homeland, such equality would have been punished. Yet here it produced order, a harmony born of distributed confidence. One evening, as they toured the electrical lab, an American sergeant named William Hart offered Brenner a cup of coffee while explaining how every new recruit learned the same standardized color codes in a 3-week course. "You can train anyone if you trust them to learn," Hart said casually. That phrase lingered like a challenge. Later that night, Eckhart wrote in his diary, "Their wires reflect their society. Parallel lines, different colors, same purpose. No hierarchy, only continuity." The engineers began to see the connection between design and ideology. The B-29's wiring system was not just efficient, it was democratic. Each component had autonomy within order. Each worker participated in the machine's intelligence. The bomber was the physical manifestation of a political idea, that collective understanding could replace authoritarian control. Standing on the tarmac at dusk, Brenner watched another B-29 lift into the orange sky, its engines glowing like molten spheres. He realized that America's true weapon was not technology, but coordination. The freedom to distribute thought. Somewhere deep within, pride faltered and respect began to grow. By the autumn of 1945, the German engineers found themselves relocated to a POW camp in Oklahoma, one of more than 500 scattered across the United States. Behind the fences, life moved with an unsettling normalcy. There were libraries, workshops, even orchestras. The engineers, men who had once designed bombers, now spent their days repairing radios and teaching English to younger prisoners. At first, they dismissed it all as propaganda, but small details began to erode that certainty. Each morning, the guards brought them breakfast, oatmeal, eggs, and strong black coffee. The man who served the trays was a black American corporal named James Walker. Brenner had never spoken to a black man as an equal before, yet Walker addressed him as "Sir," smiled, and discussed the weather. One morning, while helping repair the camp's generator, Walker asked how many volts the German system used. Brenner answered automatically, then froze. The question had been technical, fluent, intelligent. "He's no laborer," Brenner murmured later to Eckhart. "He's a technician in uniform." That moment unsettled years of belief. Back home, propaganda had painted America as chaotic, racially divided, careless. Here, the engineers saw the opposite, diversity bound by procedure. They watched women working in nearby towns, driving trucks, leading electrical crews. They heard about trade schools that taught wiring standards to farmers' sons and sharecroppers' daughters. It dawned on them that the same logic they'd admired in the B-29 wiring extended to society itself, structured, inclusive, endlessly teachable. At night, in the wooden barracks, they argued over what this meant. Heinemann still clung to pride. Their machines are soulless, he insisted. They build without art. But Eckhart countered softly. Maybe that's what makes them immortal. His voice trembled not from fear, but recognition. The sense that they were living inside the philosophy that had defeated them. One evening, Walker returned with a portable radio. American jazz spilled through the static, a wild rhythm that felt improvised yet perfectly timed. Brenner listened and thought of the B-29 wiring again. Different instruments, same harmony. They even play like they build, he whispered. When the lights dimmed, silence fell over the camp. Some men stared at their notebooks, others at the ceiling fans turning like clockwork. For the first time, Brenner felt not humiliation but curiosity. Could such freedom coexist with order? Could equality produce precision? Tell me, what do you think? If every worker were trusted as an equal, could your nation have built something as flawless as the B-29? Would we have won or lost even faster? Winter brought quiet days to the Oklahoma camp. Snow sometimes covered the fences, softening the harshness of captivity. Inside the workshop, Brenner and Eckhart had been assigned to help the American engineers inspect captured electrical equipment. Among the piles of salvaged parts was something familiar, a B-29 control panel. The sight drew them close like moths to light. This time, however, they no longer saw it as the enemy's creation, but as a masterpiece of clarity. On the back of the switchboard ran dozens of looms, bundles of wire tied with waxed laces, tagged with aluminum markers that gleamed even after a year of service. Each strand bore an identity: red for power, yellow for control, green for feedback. The Americans explained how Boeing engineers had divided the entire aircraft's electrical system into tiers: primary, secondary, auxiliary, each tested separately, each replaceable in hours. A central test board allowed ground crews to simulate every switch, every light, every gun circuit without starting an engine. The scale stunned them. Boeing's documentation listed 22,000 wiring diagrams for the B-29 program alone. Over 800 engineers oversaw electrical integration at Wichita, Seattle, and Marietta. Each sub-assembly carried its own quality tag, cross-referenced to master blueprints stored on microfilm. In Germany, such control existed only in secret research bureaus, never across whole industries. During a coffee break, Eckhart found an old letter tucked in a folder, dated June 1944, from a Boeing supervisor named Margaret Lowell to her sister. It read, "Every loom we finish feels like another heartbeat added to the plane. They tell us it will fly higher than any bomber before. I just want it to come home safely." The words struck him harder than any report. Behind the precision, there had been human warmth. Each numbered wire carried someone's care. That evening, in his own letter, addressed but never sent, Brenner wrote to his wife in Dresden, "The Americans have achieved what we tried to command. They taught discipline without fear. Their diagrams are not just instructions. They are promises of understanding." He folded the page carefully and hid it beneath his cot. The snow melted into muddy streams outside, and he stood by the window watching them trace lines across the camp yard, each current finding its way toward the same river. For a long while, he thought about circuits, freedom, and the unseen connections between people. Before turning in, he asked softly to the men around him, "If machines can be built on trust, could a nation be rebuilt that way too? What do you think? Could order ever grow from equality, or does it always need command?" Spring came, and with it, letters from Washington. The war was over. The engineers were no longer enemies. They were assets. Selected among hundreds of technical prisoners, Brenner, Heinemann, and Eckhart were transferred to Wright Field once again, this time as collaborators under supervision. They were given drafting tables, translation tasks, and the strange permission to think freely. The same American officers who once interrogated them now brought lunch trays and discussed electrical theory. Brenner's assignment was to study fault patterns in damaged B-29 wiring harnesses. As he mapped failures, he noticed something profound. Even the flaws were consistent. Each weak point reappeared in predictable places, and each repair method followed a documented process. It was a system that admitted imperfection, yet learned from it. "They evolve like living things," he told Eckhart. "Our machines died perfect. Theirs survive imperfect but alive." At the next desk, Heinemann helped interpret captured German schematics for American engineers. He expected condescension, but found curiosity instead. One young officer asked him why German cables were often hidden under metal plates. "To protect them," Heinemann answered proudly. The American nodded thoughtfully, then replied, "We keep them visible to inspect faster." That single sentence contained an entire philosophy: transparency over secrecy, trust over control. Within months, the former prisoners began advising on new post-war aircraft designs. They saw early jet prototypes on the test fields, marveling that engineers from Detroit, Cleveland, and Boston could coordinate so seamlessly without ever meeting in person. Everything was standardized: connector types, color codes, even the way diagrams were folded. It was as if the entire continent had learned to think as one organism. When their release finally came in 1946, the men boarded a train eastward through green fields and shining towns. Every station pulsed with movement: students, workers, soldiers, each part of a collective pulse that reminded them of the B-29's wiring. Individual circuits, united in purpose. Brenner kept his American-issued pencil as a souvenir. He wrote one final note before departure: "They have built a civilization on blueprints. We built one on pride. Theirs may outlast us." Back in a ruined Germany months later, he would quietly assist in reorganizing electrical networks for civilian power. When asked why he copied so many American methods, he answered only, "Because they work." The story of those men never appeared in newspapers, but in the quiet hum of Europe's rebuilding factories, the logic of the B-29 lived on. An invisible inheritance passed through circuits and minds alike. The bomber had been just a machine, yet its wiring carried a message: that intelligence, when shared, becomes power, and that an organized mind, multiplied across a nation, can change the world. Years later, when the world had forgotten the smell of burned aluminum and the echo of air raid sirens, Otto Brenner still dreamed of wires. He would wake in his small apartment near Munich, the sound of rain on the tin roof reminding him of the rhythmic tapping of rivet guns in Wichita. In those dreams, he was once again inside the fuselage of the B-29, tracing endless lines of color-coded circuits that pulsed with the memory of order. The war had destroyed cities, but it had also revealed something that would outlive destruction: the idea that intelligence could be organized, taught, and shared among ordinary people. He often thought of the Americans he had met: Sergeant Hart with his calm eyes, the black corporal who served coffee and asked about voltage, the factory women who wired bombers while humming to the radio. They were not geniuses, yet their collective discipline had achieved what the finest German minds could not. In their democracy, he had discovered not chaos, but harmony. A nation where the right to ask questions had built a web of precision stronger than command. Sometimes he would open his old notebook, now yellowed with age, and read his wartime notes. The lines still stood out. They build as if they expect thousands to follow the same pattern. He realized that this was more than observation. It was prophecy. The post-war world had indeed followed that pattern. Factories in Europe, Japan, and even the Soviet Union had adopted systems born in America's wartime production lines. The B-29 had been not just an aircraft, but a messenger of method. There were nights when he would walk past a power station, seeing cables vanish into the darkness, humming softly like veins of a living thing. He would stop and listen, imagining that somewhere within those currents ran the same spirit he had once touched in a wrecked bomber. The spirit of connection, of logic turned humane. History remembers weapons and victories, but rarely the systems that made them possible. Yet, for Brenner and his companions, the revelation had been permanent. That democracy itself could be engineered, wire by wire, trust by trust, until every citizen became a part of a greater circuit. He never returned to the ruins where the first B-29 fell. But sometimes, in the quiet of evening, he would close his eyes and see it again, the labyrinth of wires glinting in the dim light, as if a great invisible mind had once passed through metal, leaving behind the map of how to think together.